Welcome to The Witness, a podcast that explores the diverse and complex issues that our world faces today. From politics and social justice to environmental concerns and technological advancements, we aim to bring you insightful conversations and perspectives on the most pressing issues of our time. Our guests come from a wide range of backgrounds and expertise, each with a unique insight into the challenges facing our world. Through their stories and experiences, we hope to provide a deeper understanding of these complex issues and inspire meaningful dialogue and action. Join us as we bear witness to the issues that shape our world and explore the possibilities for a better future. Welcome to today's episode of our podcast. I am your host Sajjad Rasool. Our guest for today's episode is Sahar Vardi, an inspiring anti-militarism and anti-occupation activist from Jerusalem. She has been a prominent figure in the Israelis' refusal movement for over a decade and is a conscientious objector. Recently, Sahar led the Israel program for the American Friends Service Committee, where she worked on establishing the database on Israeli military and security export. Through her research and campaigns, she has raised awareness about the human rights violations associated with the Israeli arms export industry. She also recently completed her studies at the University of Bradford under the Rotary Peace Fellowship Program. Currently, Sahar chairs the board of the Human Rights Defenders Fund in Israel. In this episode, Sahar will share her experience and insights about her journey as an activist. Tell me about yourself, how you got into this activism initially.
My origin story.
Yeah,
it's
Genesis.
Like superheroes, they need an origin story.
Yeah. Tell us that.
Don't put this in when I say it's like superheroes.
Okay.
My origin story. I grew up in kind of a classic, what we call Zionist left home, which meant that I knew we were against the occupation. I had no idea what the occupation was, but we were against it. And it didn't mean much to my life for the first few years of my life, obviously, until the Second Intifada. So during the Second Intifada, buses blowing up on the streets of Jerusalem, and it was visible. It was something that was there. It was on the streets. Couldn't be ignored as easily. And at that point, my father started becoming more politically active and going to plant olive trees in Palestinian villages and things like that, and took me along. And I was like a 12-year-old, very enthusiastic kid.
Wow, 12 years.
Yeah. And started learning more and started to get to know people and places and realities and gaps in realities between my side of the city and the other side of the city. And it just kind of went all downhill from there. You know, you go to one thing and you hear about something else, and you go to this other protest and suddenly soldiers are shooting at you, and like things just, kind of escalate. And that's how I lived. Those were my teenage years. My teenage years were a lot of going to different kinds of protests and learning about realities of different Palestinian villages and trying to learn what solidarity means.
Okay, interesting. But what do you mean by saying Zionist left home?
That sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it?
Yeah, kind of, for sure.
When we talk about the Israeli political system, the Jewish Israeli political system is almost entirely within the Zionist spectrum. So the idea that there needs to be a Jewish state, that it needs to be Jewish, and within that there's a lot of Jewish superiority that we don't necessarily say, but it's ingrained in the idea of a Jewish state. That is where the vast majority of Israeli politics lies. And so even if you're on the left of that, so usually Zionist left would be for a two-state solution, would be more on the liberal side of, feminism, LGBTQ rights, environmental issues. Like they traditionally have a lot of the left components, but within that Zionist spectrum, within the concept that Jews need a state that is a Jewish state. And that already is racist, right? That already is unequal, that already is unleft. But that is the political map in Israel. The only thing that exists outside of the Zionist spectrum, politically speaking, are the Palestinian parties and the political parties of Palestinian citizens of Israel, which some of them have Jews inside of them, like the Communist Party. So that you can actually say is left, but it's a very small part of the discourse. And the vast majority, at least historically speaking, the vast majority was just the Zionist spectrum from right to left.
Okay. That's interesting. And tell us more about your journey, how you evolved through your teenage days to then obviously to college days, and how was that for you as a person and as a person coming from the Jewish family, and how difficult or how much struggle you had to put into integrating and understanding, because it requires you a lot of tension to get into. Right, it requires a lot of vulnerability to be able to understand the perspectives, I would say, and be in the support of the people who don't necessarily look like you, or who do not necessarily align with any Zionist Jewish thought.
I think it requires a lot of unlearning more than it requires learning, right? If you actually just take kids and let them play, they don't know who's who and what's what and why.
Yeah.
Right? The problem is that we get all this information and we need to unlearn it. And I think it's impossible, and it's a process that takes our entire life, and we keep learning and unlearning things. But for me, I was very lucky for this process to start relatively very early. I think that, so as a 14-year-old, was the first time I went to protests in the West Bank that were really protests, that were, the clashes that people would see on TV. This is in a village called Bil'ain, which is just outside of Ramallah, just east of Ramallah. And they had protests, weekly protests since 2004, 2005. And in those protests, we'd come to a Palestinian village, walk from the center of the village towards where they were building the fence at the time. These protests were against the building of the fence. And before we'd even come close, you'd have soldiers shooting, tear gas, whatever. And I think that in many ways, it's everything talking about learning, right? I learned that soldiers are there to protect me. That is their essence in life. That's why they exist. And Palestinians in many ways are a threat. Right, you grow up even in a lefty house, even without your parents ever telling you Palestinians are a threat. Everything around you is telling you that, right?
Right.
And then you come to a protest where soldiers are shooting at you, and Palestinians are offering you shelter in their homes, and it doesn't work anymore. That dichotomy, right? And I think it's important to say, for me, it didn't switch. It didn't mean that now soldiers were the enemy, right? Because I knew them. A year later, my brother joined the military. They're not your enemy. You know them, right? It just breaks a bit of that dichotomy,
right?
Of who's supposed to protect you, who's supposed to harm you. And I think it is interesting because, you're asking about learning and the process and stuff like that. I think it is interesting because even though I could have that experience at 14, it doesn't mean that today I'm free of that mindset, right?
Okay.
I still have a lot of that racism internalized within me. If I walk the streets of Ramallah and in the middle of a Palestinian city, there still is a part of me that is afraid of Palestinians.
Why do you think, why does that happen? I understand that the environment you grow up in, you already are told that there's a threat, and consciously, subconsciously, those things are seeded into our minds. What else do you think that plays an important role in having that mentality and perception?
I think there's a lot of things, right? And we can, again, translate this into racism everywhere, right? That we get taught these things about specific groups that we should be afraid of, and that fear becomes ingrained within us. And then also every small example in reality that fits into that just strengthens it, right? So the truth is, as an Israeli in Ramallah, yes, there are Palestinians who would like to take advantage of being able to, I don't know hold me for ransom or whatever. Like, that hasn't actually happened much at all, but it has happened a few times in history, right? Because there's an occupation, because it makes sense, because I symbolize an oppressor, right? Like, it's not that the violence doesn't exist, it exists.
Right.
And then just the knowledge that it exists, even if you know that it's 0.000 whatever percent, but you know that rationally, and then it's added with all this emotional thing of how you are raised into that, you bring them all together, and it's still there, and it's still part of us. And I think it is important to recognize, because I think when we talk about unlearning things, we need to understand that it's not just a mental process, it's also an emotional process. Right? It's an emotional process of feeling different, of learning to feel safe, to feel equal, right?
Yeah, that's very true. But how, like, is there any sort of like episode which you want to mention here while this process of unlearning was going on, which helped you, like, which was disturbing for you as a person, which was like quite a challenge to deal with? I mean, any sort of incident, because it's when you started activism, you were quite young. And who was a person who like helped you go through that journey?
I think because I was so young, it was a lot of different people. I think a lot of people have like a turning point. I don't have a turning point. It was kind of a process that was almost natural. Again, because of the age I was in. Obviously, my father had a big role in it, introducing me to this world. But he was also going through a process. And I think actually our mutual process was really interesting because on the one hand, we could introduce each other to new things and in many ways radicalize each other. But it was also interesting to see how different that process was because I had much less to unlearn. Right? My father still defined himself as a Zionist up until probably 10 years ago, which was way into his activism after, I mean, when I was 14, 15, something like that, he got shot by a settler, like had a shrapnel in his stomach. Like he was in hardcore activism. Like he was in, all the same protests that I was in. We were getting beat up together, getting arrested together, like all these things that are clearly on the radical side of activism, including when I refused military service, and he was very supportive of that. And he refused his military service back in 91 in the first, reserve service in the first Intifada. But throughout this entire process, he still defined himself as a Zionist, which is crazy because nothing about his actions, nothing about his actual perception of the world was that. But it was a part of his identity, right? And for me, it was really easy. Like 12, 13, 14, Zionism out the window. No way. And it was really interesting to see how that process was longer. And now he's like, no, of course not. But it had to take longer because it's part of the identity. The same goes with even the conversations we would have about military service. I mean, he served in the military. He served in a combat unit. He was drafted in 1973. Like his first experience of a war was an actual war, not what we're talking about today. And yes, he refused military service in 91 in his reserve service, but he did it from a very emotional place, right? His own place. And when it came my time to refuse, he was supportive, but he was supportive in very militarized terms. Like he was like, okay, you want to refuse, but go to prison, pay the price for it, sacrifice for it.
Yeah.
Because you need to sacrifice for the things you believe in. And it almost didn't matter for him if you sacrificed by going to the military and fighting, or if you sacrificed by going to prison, as long as you pay a price, which is still a very militaristic idea.
Very strong
right?
approach, yeah.
Masculine, very, very much that. But he was still there. And if you talk to him about it now, I have 2 younger sisters, they both didn't serve in the military, neither of them going to prison, it's all good. And he's obviously very supportive of that. And he's like in a different place. Like processes take time for all of us. But the younger we are when we start, the easier it is to move, the easier it is to shift.
Why did you refuse? I mean, I have the answers why you refused, obviously. But how was the process of like refusal and how you got out of it and what happened next?
So we're supposed to join the military at 18. It's mandatory for men and women. There are a few ways out of military service, from getting married if you're a woman or having a child.
Shortcuts.
Yes. There's actually, like, it's really interesting, like the early meetings in which they discuss military service, and they say, okay, women, if they're married or pregnant, so if like they're on their way to having a family, they're already serving the state.
Okay.
So they don't need to serve it, right? Like women can choose. You can serve as a soldier, or you can serve by having babies and creating the nation, right? Like it's a very clear idea of what our role is in life. But anyway, there's those ways. You can get out through mental health, which is the most common way to get out of military service. It's the easiest way out. So anxiety, depression, all kinds of things. You need to convince the military of your position or your status.
Health status.
And get out. And a lot of people do it. So last night I was on a call with a kid, an 18-year-old kid who wants to get out of the military and is like desperate and doesn't know how, and just explaining the process to him and how this works and what happens when you sit in front of a military psychiatrist and need to convince them that you cannot serve. But it's the most common way out of service. And then there is the option of being recognized as a conscientious objector in Israel, which is extremely hard. Mm-hmm. They only exempt pacifists with a very narrow definition of what pacifism is. And it's a military committee. You're like a 17-year-old kid sitting in front of a panel of 7 soldiers who are like yelling at you questions, and you're supposed to somehow convince them of something. It's a bit of an absurd situation.
But you're not allowed to be accompanied by somebody, a lawyer or something.
You're just sitting there alone, you and all these soldiers. It's a very fun experience. And they interrupt you and they ask all these questions. They're the most ridiculous questions. Like, I mean, someone attacks you on the street, what do you do? Like, I know friends who were asked, like, if you were standing in front of Hitler with a gun, what would you do? Like, right? Like, very realistic questions that were all moral dilemmas that we have to deal with right now. But also their idea of pacifism is very non-political. Mm-hmm. So if you refuse because of the occupation, if the occupation is part of your reasoning, they don't recognize that as conscientious objection. Okay. Because it's political. Which is like, obviously, the military is political. This is all political, but that's not the conversation they're having. And so for me, it was very clear. Like, I walked into that committee and, I already had a rap sheet. Like, they can see my criminal record and all the times I got arrested in protest, and they're just like asking me about that. And like, there's no point in lying. I didn't want to lie. Yes, for me, refusing was about the occupation. Am I also more widely against violence? Yes. But refusing was about the occupation. This is the main thing the Israeli military does, the main form of violence that it's implementing. It's not something I'd want to ignore. And so I was not recognized as a conscientious objector, and I have a letter that says, you are not a person of conscience, and therefore you can join the military. Okay. It's always fun that they put it that way. You're like, okay, that's good to know. And so I refused by going to prison, or like just showing up on my enlistment date and saying, nope, this is not going to happen. But I did that with a group of friends. Mm-hmm. And like we brought people around us who were at the same stage. We wrote a public letter explaining why we're refusing. And for me, that was important to make it a political act. I think refusing is a few different things. Refusing is saying, I'm not going to be part of that, which is important. Mm-hmm. But refusing publicly is also about kind of putting a mirror to the rest of society. And we don't talk about the occupation. Israelis don't need to talk about the occupation. So any excuse, including our conscription as an excuse, mm-hmm. is like, it gives us political power, right? The fact that there is conscription allows 18-year-olds to say, no, we're not going to do that. But that's the power that conscription gives youth. Right. It's saying, like, if you're going to force us into this army, we have a say. We should have a say in this. And it's really sad for me that most Israelis today, most 18-year-olds going into the military, don't see it as political at all. Mm-hmm. And they don't see it as a choice at all. And they don't see it as something that we should be talking about politically. But it is. Right. So when you refuse, so did it like inspire and encourage other people as well to come forward and refuse later on? Like, what was the impact of your refusal? On a small scale, yes, refusal always impacts other people. Every time we have someone refusing, I mean, our year we had a lot of like media coverage, and it was in the conversation. Today you can see it a lot on social media. When someone refuses, it's all over the place on social media, for better or worse. But every time that happens, the amount of people who contact different refusal organizations to try to get out as well, like, increases every time, because it becomes an option, right? Nobody says it's an option, and then someone's like, oh, it's an option, cool, we can talk about it. But I think the political aspect of that is limited. We're not going to get to a phase where there's enough people refusing to change military policies.
Yeah, that's true, but it's not a question of like how many people actually refuse. The point is that it's a political stance. It's a very, very strong stance.
Exactly, and I think that strong stance does a few things. So it gives space to people who want to refuse, which is great. It reminds, or tries to remind us, that the military is political, right? And the third thing that it does, and I didn't really understand this before refusing, but it became very strong after refusing, like this understanding, is that it also positions you in front of Palestinians differently.
Okay.
Right? It's telling Palestinians that you work with, I mean, the kind of people that I was growing up with in the protests, that I'm not going to be part of their occupying force. And if there's a price to pay for that, I'll pay it. Like, I would rather sit in prison than be your occupier, right? I'm still their occupier in a lot of other ways, like the taxes that I pay and the privilege that I have, but at least in this symbolic act. And usually when people refuse, we kind of write these letters around refusal. So we wrote a collective one, but we also each wrote a personal one. And the letter that I wrote was a lot about the first Palestinian village that I was in, when I was talking about this olive planting that my father took me to. It's a small village called Naaman, just south of Jerusalem. And I kind of grew up in that village. I kept going for it for years and had a lot of experiences of kind of understanding my privilege and understanding the difference between my life and the life of kids there in that village. And I wrote about that in my letter. Like, my refusal letter is a lot about that. And when I was in prison, my father went to the village and read them my refusal letter, like the kind of the reasons of why I'm refusing. And he called me in prison after he went there to like talk about the experience, right? And he said, like, people were crying. And it's crazy. I mean, if you stop for a second and think about it, like, why would someone be emotional or like feel like it's a great thing that someone is not occupying them? Like, it's ridiculous. Like, this should be the basic standard that we require from everyone around us, right? But it isn't. And it is that as well, right? It is a form of solidarity. It is a form of relationship. And I think historically, the Israeli left, when it worked with Palestinians always had to get over the fact that everyone they worked with used to be soldiers, which is a lot to get over, right?
Right.
And they did. Like, Palestinians in the joint movement had to deal with that. But there is something about our generation. There's a generation where a lot of the activists didn't serve in the military that makes it much easier. That has the starting point somewhere much closer. That, we're not asking Palestinians to, before we even start doing anything, oh, by the way, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I was marching these streets with an M16 and maybe we met already at checkpoint, Skipping that phase is also part of, I think it's also part of building the future that we want to see.
As you said, like, military is a political institution. It's part of the politics. Was that the reason that you wanted to like work against the militarization, and like all of your work and your life is kind of dedicated towards this cause?
I'll start by saying that I think that there's always a question of like, what is the role of different people in a struggle, right? What is the role of Palestinians in the struggle? What is the role of Israeli left in the struggle? And I think that a lot of the answers, there's multiple answers, and you can have a lot of roles, but one of the roles, at least of Israelis, is to try to understand how we change our own society and why our society looks the way that it does. And I think a lot of it is militarization, right? A lot of the reason that we act the way we do is how we're constructed. And we can talk a lot about how fear is constructed within Israeli society. And that's a process. But its outcome is this militarization. So for me, like, that's part of my responsibility as an Israeli, is to work around militarization, because I really think it's a core part of how we function as a society. Other aspect of it, I mean, and in more recent years, looking at the economic aspect of it, looking at the arms trade, is just understanding how much is under the surface, right? Militarization we see on the streets. You walk through the streets of Jerusalem, you'll see soldiers on uniform with guns, you'll see soldiers off uniform with guns, you'll see names of streets named after this military unit or that military unit, you'll see, tanks that kids can play around in all kinds of villages in the middle of nowhere. Like, you want to see militarization, you just look around you.
It's physically visible. Yeah.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
But like, the economic aspect of it, the fact that people are making a profit out of it, that's not visible. We don't talk about it. And that allows militarization to only be in this place of like protection, security, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But you're like, no, people are making money off of this. This is like part of a capitalist system. Like, that, it has to be part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, it has not become a part of conversation in most of countries around the world.
Yeah. And
why do you think so? Why do you think it has not become a mainstream conversation?
It's a good question. I think it's a combination of a lot of things. First of all, there's a huge amount of secrecy around this industry.
Yeah.
And they're allowed much more secrecy than any other industry is, because it's, confidential, it's security reasons, blah, 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 blah. They're allowed that. So I think that that's a huge part of it. I think another part of it is that it's somehow not interesting. Like, it's, it's figures, it's things that are happening very far away. And it's things that are good for most countries, economically speaking, right? So a citizen of, I don't know, Spain or Sweden or Israel or the US, all countries who are in the 10 biggest exporters of arms in the world, they don't feel those arms, right? It's not going to work against them.
Right.
But they feel the tax benefits. And none of them know it. None of them think about it. But actually, it's kind of convenient that so much of our economy, like, who cares what it's based on as long as it makes money, right? And it does. It makes money. It creates jobs. It has a whole industry to it. And it's not an efficient way to create jobs. Like, I want to clarify. If we would have put, as societies, the same amount of resources into a sector as we do the defense sector, but to a different sector, health or education, we would create much more jobs. Like, actually, the economic argument doesn't really work. But if we're just being very simplistic, which we usually are, you see jobs being created and people doing what they're doing, and it sounds almost technical. It's just another sector, like other sectors, whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
And people don't think about the consequences of these sectors. People don't look at what happens at the end of an assembly line, right? The people who are working on it. And there's very few cases. There's a really interesting story that happened in Italy in the end of the 90s, in the middle of the anti-mine campaign. So landmines there was a huge campaign against landmines in the 90s that ended with a treaty against landmines. But around the world, there were, campaigns around it, and Italian campaigners, as a lot of European campaigners, did the thing of like building a camp and staying there for months outside of a mine factory. And they built a relationship with the union of the mine factory and just educated them and just explained to them what mines do, right? These were people in an assembly line doing their job.
Right.
And they had these conversations to the point where the union closed down the factory, which I think is the only time of history that I've heard, like, on like an arms issue, a union just said, oh, we don't want to do that. And it's crazy because they were working at it for years,
right,
and not thinking about that connection.
And it's related to their livelihood and employment also.
And most of us, that's how we live our lives. We don't think about the things we do. We don't think about the minerals and how those minerals were created for this little machine that I hold in my hand and I'm addicted to with my phone. We don't think about who is making the clothes that we wear. Why would we think about, with weapons, we feel like it should be more clear, but is it really?
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Witness Podcast, where we had the privilege of speaking with Sahar Vardi, an anti-militarism and anti-occupation activist from Jerusalem. We sincerely hope that you enjoyed the conversation. As we wrap up this episode, we want to encourage you to tune into our next episode, where we will continue our conversation with Sahar. We will dive into topics such as militarism, the Palestinian occupation, and the military trade. Don't miss out on this important discussion. In the meantime, subscribe to our channel and share this podcast. Goodbye for now.